Good evening and welcome to our new podcast. This is History Done Right, and we hope to make this a weekly podcast every Monday, presented by Bradford Christian College. History Done Right. First, let me say this is sponsored by Bradford Christian College. You've heard me talk about Bradford Christian College before, an online college providing a number of bachelor's degrees options and also a Master of Arts in Theology option. Um, it's an online college, but you're not doing it all alone. A mentor is assigned and will walk with you through your program, meeting with the mentor on a regular basis. You will um, be able to ask questions about the subject material. Um, The mentor will ask you questions to challenge you, maybe extend your application beyond the um, specific course application. Uh, and so it's an opportunity to have somebody as your own personal coach walking you through your program of study to achieve your degree. So I think that makes Bradford Christian College unique um, and accessible. It could well be your choice, best choice for um, continuing your education, getting that bachelor degree, or as I said, a Master of Arts in Theological Studies um, degree that will help you pursue what it is you are interested in, what you feel called to. Um, and so I encourage you to check out Bradford Christian College, link in the description below. Contact them, ask it questions, um, see if it's not the right fit for you or a good recommendation that you can make to others. Sharing that information can only be helpful, um, just like sharing um, our various podcasts can only be helpful. And this is a new podcast we're starting. Like I said, on Mondays now, History Done Right. I'll talk about what we mean by that and what this podcast will hopefully encompass in just a moment. But tomorrow night, on Tuesday nights, the Lantern's Quest podcast, which has been going for quite some time now. I think we're up to episode 24, maybe. I don't know. You can see it online at youtube.com. You can see the um, promo for that. But yeah, the main thing that Lantern's Quest is doing is examining the Gospel of Mark. We call it Exploring a Sketchbook of Christ. And I think it's been a wonderful study through the Gospel of Mark, um, which is a wonderful gospel for someone who's uh, maybe even beginning to have an interest in who is this man Jesus. And I think it's been a great study. So that's on Tuesdays. Every once in a while, um, we throw in what we call reaction time, and that's where pastors David Barrett and Lucas Bombach get a chance to react to some event, news item, trend, culturally, and try to react to what's happening from a biblical basis. Then on Wednesdays, we have our midweek study. Okay, our midweek study on Wednesdays. And in that podcast, we are currently, I think this Wednesday, we'll be able to complete an election sermon that we've been working through. The title of that election sermon is Christianity, a National Law. And the idea there, really, that's what kind of well, this one's kind of a selfish podcast too. Maybe these podcasts are more selfish than I care to admit, but Wednesday's midweek study is particularly selfish. I have a stack of stuff that I've wanted to read through, and I thought, you know what? I'm going to schedule a weekly podcast, and I'm going to start reading through my stack of stuff, and that'll be a way for me to have a schedule of reading through it, if um, even if somewhat slowly, um, we read through it. Then on Fridays, we have a podcast that we call Random Cast. And in that podcast, it's just random what I might look at, typically some current events, current news stories, um, look at those and try to have a biblical thought or two about them. As you can see with all of these podcasts, we don't have all the answers, and where we like to think that we're benefiting you with our commentary and such, um, we can benefit from your commentary. And so that's why there's a comments section. And please do um, post comments, like the videos. I guess that helps them spread. And you can see that we're not spread very far, but that's okay. We're not looking to, we want people that, uh, to view our videos that are really going to benefit from them, and really strengthen a Christian faith that they already hold, um, compel and draw them to a Christian faith that they need to embrace. That's really, and be educational, right? Um, that we might grow in wisdom and knowledge, right? Okay, so let's think about what it is that we intend to do with our podcast here, History Done Right. If you look in the description for this podcast or this video, you'll see we have the verse Revelation 2:5 from the King James, which says, "Remember therefore from whence thou art fallen, and repent, and do the first works, or else I will come unto thee quickly, and will remove thy candlestick out of his place, except thou repent." Right? So there's definitely an emphasis on repentance. But notice how the verse begins, remembering, which seems to go hand in hand with repentance. And so, as we suggest in our description, remembering or doing history is important. That means it is worth doing right. More than we know, we have been influenced and shaped by incorrect views of history. And so the purpose of this podcast is to set that right. So that's what we're looking to do through History Done Right. Okay. All right. So let's think about a few things here as we begin our podcast. And I'm going to be scribbling some notes here. You're welcome to take notes along with me. Let's get a decent color. We write in blue ink, right? So let's call this our History Done Right number 1. Okay. Now, I'm going to set out tonight 2 foundation stones that I think are critical if we're going to do history right. And with the first foundation stone, I think I want to kind of illustrate how deeply influenced most of us are or have been away from a true foundation stone. Okay, let me get that out of the way. So this will be foundation stone. I know there's nothing fancy about this. I don't have fancy slides or anything, but I didn't know what I was going to say. This is like as I'm doing. All right, so foundation stone number 1. Okay. And here's what I want to say for foundation stone number 1 when it comes to approaching history. Okay. And we'll say it this way. The God of the Bible, and I think you all know what I mean there, right? The 66 books of the New and Old Testament. The God of the Bible is the creator of all things that exist, just as recorded in the Bible. Okay. Now, if you're familiar with the Bible and such, then you'll immediately think of Genesis chapter 1, but you should think of Genesis chapter 2 as well. Um, But then you should think of other verses as well. We know from the New Testament that um, Christ is identified as the active agent, if you will, in creation, that uh, he is a creator, and we see that in his um, miraculous works when he walks the earth. And in particular, I would point you to his miraculous work of turning water into wine. Right now, there he took something and made it something, but we'll maybe talk a little bit more about that miracle in just a moment. Now, one of the things that we have to get clear in our head is um, we have to come to and okay, we have to come to a an understanding. Um, I'll say a belief, but I also by that I don't mean, you know, um, some kind of irrational leap of faith or anything like that. But we must believe and hold dear the truth that the Bible is God's word to us. Okay, it's divinely inspired. The entire scriptures, all 66 books of Old and New Testament, divinely inspired, and they are all of those words are true. Um, and we ourselves should not stand as a critic over the Bible to say, well, this part is true and this part isn't. We can accept this part and we don't want to accept that part. No, we are to accept the whole of the Bible. Um, Neither are we to let any particular subject of study serve as a lens through which we view the Bible. Um, in fact, the Bible is to be the lens through which we view every subject. Okay. And so, but well, first, let me say, I love the way Noah Webster in his 1828 dictionary um, defines the word Bible, which comes from the Greek biblos or biblos. I'm not sure about the pronunciation there, but that was my lame effort at meaning a book. And the way he defines the word Bible in his 1828, and if you don't have his 1828, you should get it. You can get a hard copy version so that you can feel the pages that Webster produced. It's online. You can just search Webster's 1828 dictionary and you can access it. But here's how he defines the word Bible. He starts out with two words and he writes, the book. And he capitalizes every single letter in those two words. The book. Okay. Now, if you know anything about English language, um, a or an is the indefinite article. The is the definite article, right? And so if I ask you to bring me an apple, right? I'm not particular. Just bring whatever apple you happen to find in the refrigerator or wherever the apples are kept at your house. um, but if I ask you to bring me the apple, I'm asking for a specific apple, an apple that stands apart from every other apple in the group. And that's what Webster's saying here. This is the book that stands apart from every other book in the group of books. So the book, and then he goes on, by way of eminence. Okay, eminence is holding the higher place, the highest, in this case, the highest place. Okay, it's the book because it is higher than in every possible way. It is higher than any other book ever written. He continues, the sacred volume in which are contained the revelations of God, the principles of Christian faith, and the rules of practice. Okay, and so he makes it clear that this book, by way of eminence, contains that which we are to believe and that which we are to do. Okay, it's a great definition, and that needs to be settled in your mind, right? And we need to quit being embarrassed or ashamed of the Bible if we are um, hesitant to really lean on the Bible for truth, right? Feeling like we have to, um, you know, submit the Bible to the um, wildly varying claims of science through history. Okay. It's not necessary. The Bible is true in everything that it says to us. And it's particularly true in how things began, creation. And we need to get that settled. If it's not settled for you, if you have hesitancy about the imminence of the book, then you need to do some extra reading, extra research to shore up your faith in that regard. And I'm sure there are plenty of great resources out there that talk about how we got the Bible, why you should love the Bible. One that I will recommend, and I recommend this as um, not something to try to convince an unbeliever about the Bible, because I think it's the wrong way to approach that. I recommend this as a resource for a believer who wants to strengthen um, their hopefully closely held belief that the Bible is the divinely inspired Word of God without error. Um, and so I recommend, it, I think it's now in a one-volume work, but it originally was two different volumes, Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell. And there's a section in one of those volumes where he goes through evidence about the reliability of scriptures. And I think that can be really helpful. And as I said, I'm sure there's other resources that are helpful in this regard as well. But I think that could be really helpful to shore up, strengthen the hold we have on um, our embracing of the Bible as being truly true. Okay. But that's got to get settled. And along with that, it needs to be settled in your mind, and this should be settled in your mind as you embrace the 66 books of the Old and New Testament. Um, that God is the creator of all things, okay? That nothing came to be on this earth without, in its original, being created by God himself. In Genesis chapter 1, in a very beautiful way, but also as a master essay, sets forth that creation story. Now, you will hear all manner of arguments, and some of them seemingly to be very scientifically based, against the 6-day creation story, the 24-hour day creation story in Scripture. But let's not be ashamed of what our scriptures inform us of regarding the creation of things. Because, and this what I'm going to share right now is something that came up in the physical science class I was teaching today. Um, some will argue that, well, there are processes of fossilization or petrifaction that's petrified wood. Please be impressed. I used big words, but anyway, I'm just using the words from our science lesson today. But these are processes that take a long time, they say. Certainly more time than perhaps would be allowed for in young Earth's 6,000, 6,500 years old at this point. What's interesting is that in a mine somewhere, forget where the mine was located, um, a petrified hat was found, and the hat was 75 years old. It was petrified. That means to be petrified means literally to be turned to stone, right? Anything that's organic is replaced by mineralization, and yet the shape and the form of it remains as it was previous to petrifaction. Um, but 75 years old. And how did it happen? Well, now listen, this was the description of how it happened. Mineral-rich water flooded the mine where this hat had been left, and petrifaction occurred. And because the conditions were right, the petrifaction occurred, we could say, rapidly. So think about that. Petrifaction occurred because there was a flooding of mineral-rich water. And then think about what your Bible informs you of. And is it possible that there would be some kind of an event that happened in history in which mineral-rich water would have flooded an area, quite large area, and provided the proper conditions for petrifaction? Hmm. And so you see, we don't have to be left with um, a non-answer to those who make their claims that science tells us it's thus and so. The scriptures can inform us. Now, and I'm not even suggesting that, you've got some Yahoo out there that's, oh, the Christian fantasy of this and that and what have you. Um, I'm not saying though that, oh, okay, so I can use that and that'll be persuasive enough to convince them otherwise. Well, probably it won't, right? They have their presupposition that they're married to, and it's going to be hard to break that. My main point in bringing that up is for you, for your protection, that your faith not be shipwrecked by the foolish claims of pagans with their, wildly varying scientific theories over time. But that that, oh no, the things that we uncover as we search this earth and find things, it's all explainable within the biblical time frame. And you can know that, and you can remain steadfast. Now, another argument that comes up regarding creation is um, I've even heard some say, well, um, if if God created the way that young Earth people suggest, that would make God a liar because things appear older than that. Well, this gets back to the miracle of the water into wine. Okay. So let's think about that story, right? Um, Jesus' instructions are to fill the pots with water, and then it seems as though as they poured the water into the cups, but however it worked, that water became wine. And we have it on good authority in the story because it was like the wine connoisseur who speaks up, who says that this was the best wine, right? Like what did he say? Most serve their best wine, and then when as people get drunk, they serve cheap wine, right? And he said this is the best wine, right? So think about how wine would come to take on the characteristics and the qualities to be best wine. And it takes on those characteristics and qualities because it is aged for some amount of time, right? That's how wine becomes the best wine. It's aged. But if the story had gone that this connoisseur tasted, wow, this is the best wine, and turned to Jesus and said, where, sir, did you come up with this wine, and where have you stored it? And Jesus, not ever telling a lie, would say, um, oh, I just got it. I just produced it. It was just produced before I served it. And the connoisseur would be, that's not possible. This is just not possible. So think about it. Jesus created that wine, not, and see, this is where um, the unbelievers get this wrong when they say, "Oh, God would be a liar because things have the appearance of an age greater than the time frame of the biblical narrative chronology." But see, that's where they get it wrong, because it's not just that it has the appearance of age. Embedded in it are all the characteristics that develop because of that age, right? Um, and so I'm just going to suggest, if the active agent in creation can do that with water into wine, I don't think it would be any problem for him to create not just trees that appear to be old or older, but all the characteristics and qualities that come about in a tree because of that age are in there, right? Um, but here's maybe the biggest thing when it comes to creation and really embracing the creation story. Um, I mean, those things are big, don't get me wrong, but I think I think that there are believers who feel settled on, yep, God created everything. I'm settled on a young earth and that. But then when it comes specifically to history, they stumble at this point. And so they're not doing history right. They're doing history unright, non-right, or however you want to say it. And it's this. Probably most of us think that the history trend is the farther back you go, the less intelligent, the less sophisticated, the less technological humans were, right? We've all been influenced by um, the caveman view of history, right? I mean, we just can't deny it. It is, it is pounded into us through media, through school studies. It's just, um, that's the way we think. Now, I failed to get one resource up on my machine here, so let me access that now, because here's something I want you to think about. First off, what I want you to think about is, let me get that out of the way there. I'm trying to, only got so much real estate on my computer screen, right? First thing I want you to think about, and again, Noah Webster's 1828 dictionary is really helpful with this in his introduction when he talks about language. And man, Noah Webster decided to do history right. And he said, well, it's clear that language is a gift from God, and that from the very first, Um, uh, from the very first, Adam and Eve were able to communicate in complete sentences, it would seem. They could express their ideas and their thoughts. They could hear God speak and they could understand, right? They were even um, uh, nuanced enough in their communication to, you know, massage God's words to try to rationalize their choices or whatever you want to say. See, and I would say that uh, we tend to not incorporate that rigorously into our view of history. We think of early man as grunting and groaning and kind of without a language and eventually developing that language over time. But it's not history done right. Like I said, um, we think that the farther back you go, the more primitive everything is, um, without technology. But here's something I want you to think about. There was from creation to the universal flood, there's 1,656 years of living on this earth. Okay. So let's go back. Let's see, what year is this? 2025, I guess, right? So if we went back 1,656 years, that's going to be too hard for me to figure out. Let's just go back 1,600 years, right? That'd be the year 425. Okay. Look at the progress technologically we've made in 1,600 years. Oh, yeah, but Adam and Eve were starting with nothing. Okay, well, what did we have in 425? Okay. Comparatively, nothing. Now, that's not entirely true because we had the wheel, right? You had the aqueducts of Rome, or whatever. Right. So we had a better starting point. But here's my point. Um, um, for the years that Adam and Eve and their descendants live, um, the earth isn't that far removed from the perfection of the garden, right? It hasn't had a chance to suffer under the curse, and certainly it hasn't experienced the violent judgment of God that is the flood, right? See, this is another thing that we need to incorporate into history done right. The earth that we look at and we think is so beautiful, and it is, and it's the majesty of the mountains um, and even in its moments of violence, there's beauty in the lightning storm and hearing the ominous and yet awesome thunder that can come from that. I mean, but this is the earth that we live in is the result of the judgment of God, right, on mankind. And yet it's so marvelously beautiful. Well, what was it before? Before God in his wrath brought down judgment on mankind. What was it like before that? I don't know. My impression is that it didn't have the tall mountains that we have today, that those are a consequence of God's judgment upon us. Um, but yeah, 1,656 years, that's a lot of time to develop I don't know what. And, I don't know what we think about because I think all we really think about is Noah and his family at the time of the flood, right? Where our thoughts are not on the people that are drowning in that flood. Um, but I don't think it was just, 15 other people, right? I know some people who are really smart at population estimates and such. I mean, the estimates vary greatly from the millions, hundreds of millions to billions even of people. I mean, I guess we could let me ask the interwebs right now. I'm doing this live. This is exciting. I'm doing this live. Oops, I'm moving things on my desk here. Let's see. Compare world population 425 AD to 2025 AD. Let's see what the interwebs tell us. Okay, so the most widely accepted figure for world population in 425 AD is 200 million. Oh, good. That's a nice round number, 200 million. And the most widely accepted figure for world population today is 8.2 billion people. Now, again, they had a head start, right? Because in the first 1,656 years, you started with two people, right? Um, so that's a 41 times increase. Okay. Now, of course, a big difference is that prior to the flood, on average, it would seem that people lived about 10 times longer than we live today, right? I don't know, average lifespan today is what, 78 or something, and 780 years was pretty common, it seems, back then. And if you're living that much longer, you have that much more opportunity to have babies. So I don't know how large the population was, but I'm guessing it was more than, you know, 278 people. It wouldn't surprise me if it was 278 million people. I don't know, maybe 2 billion, but I don't know how large the population was before the flood. Mm. But they had plenty of opportunity, and I would argue maybe even better opportunity to um, experience technological progress because an individual person could lived for such a long time that they could take on the project of, I don't know, developing the radio, right? I know you see you probably think, oh, that's just crazy talk, right? Well, I don't know. In the last 1,656 years, that was something that was developed, was the radio, right? And I don't know what advantages starting in 425 AD. I don't know what advantages we had to develop a radio that was advantages over them. Like what happened leading up to 425 AD that suggested radio? I don't know, right? So, but here's the thing. One guy prior to the flood could pick up the idea of the radio and he could start working on it and he could keep working on it and finally accomplish it. And, he could have worked on it for 100 years, right? I mean, I'm guessing that if you had 100 years to work on a project, you could work out all the kinks and develop that technology, whatever you're working on. And that would be easier then, somebody starts working on it, dies, and now somebody else has to pick up that work. Well, what were they doing? What does this mean? And trying to understand their blueprints or whatever and pick it up and go from there, right? I think that's really important to keep this in mind, that the flow of history is not that, if you think intellectually or whatever, that mankind starts at this low point and has been continually improving. I don't think that's the flow of history at all. I think the right flow of history is that mankind starts at a relatively high point, and then with sin, he begins to decline. And what you see in the Old Testament, as you move through the Old Testament, is the continuing degradation of living standards because of sinfulness. In fact, archaeologically, when houses in Abraham's hometown are compared to houses much later times and later empires of the Old Testament, the houses of Abraham's time are much more advanced, much more beautiful than what people are living in later. And so, as sin has its way throughout the Old Testament, we see a decline. And then, maybe at its bottom, at its worst, I don't know, but we have that singular event of Christ. And what do we see going forward? We see, generally speaking, an upward trend in living standards, technology, right? This is really more like the flow of history. Okay. It's not this where it just seems to be going up and up and up, going from a very low point to a very high point. And this is where you get chronological snobbery right here. This is where um, people living today think that people who lived before them were always dumber, were always less intelligent, less advanced. And that's simply not the case. In fact, I'm going to argue that the closer you get to Adam and Eve, the more intelligent, the more technologically advanced things are. Now, I don't know how they compare to today, right? In that, right? We might be more technologically advanced today than they were before the flood. I don't know. Um, but I think it's important to keep that in mind. That the farther you go back in history, it's not that you're coming up to um, people that are grunting and groaning and trying to figure out um, fire, like what, um, and carrying clubs around and such. And I mean, one of the ways we know that is we're told, we're told this truth in when we're told about the descendants of Cain, right? And we're told that among his descendants are those who were the ones who dwelt in tents and have livestock, right? That's husbandry, right? The industry of husbandry starts up. Um, the one who is the forger of instruments of bronze and iron. Well, how do you forge bronze and iron? Well, it's that you have fire, but not just that you have fire, but you know how to control fire, right? You know how to intensify the fire when you need it intensified to be able to do the work. Like you have manufacturing, right? And then you have the other um, who is uh, the father of those who play the lyre and the pipe, right? The arts, instrumentation. Um, and I mean, that's early in history, that sort of things. This is early in history that these things are happening. All right, foundation stone two. And I don't know that I'll get all the way through foundation stone two. I may just go. I see that, some YouTubers, they'll post videos that are 3 hours, 5 hours long. It's like, my word, what are they doing? Um, but here's foundation stone number two. When it comes to doing history right, sorry, I need to brand myself here. When it comes to history done right, here's foundation stone number two. And foundation stone number two is the providential view of history. Okay, the providential view of history. Now, um, I think a lot of people have heard of this word providence. Maybe you haven't heard the word providence. So I think it's worth um, defining from, of course, Webster's 1828. Um, his third definition is the one that's of particular interest to us because it starts in theology. And I'll just stop there and say this is one reason why Webster's 1828 is such a wonderful dictionary, because oftentimes he has particular definitions of words related to its use in theology, which is really helpful. A lot of times he has biblical Bible references for the different definitions. In fact, he'll define a word by the different ways it's used in the Bible, which is really, it becomes, in that respect, a dictionary to the Bible. Okay, so providence in theology, the care and superintendence which God exercises over his creatures. Okay, the care and superintendence which God exercises over his creatures. Do you believe that? Do you believe that God cares and superintends over you? Do we really believe that God sees the sparrow that lands on a branch, or I guess some would say falls from that branch? I don't know, but um, I mean, do we really believe that we know that his eye is on the sparrow, and so therefore we know that his eye is on each of us? Um, and do we really hold that truth as a lens through which we look at history? And so what I want to do at this point is show you some examples of what your history class in a United States of America school as recently as the late 1800s would have looked like. Okay. And so we're going to be reading from some old history texts. But and I bring this up because I want to demonstrate what's meant by a providential view of history, but I also want to show to you that a providential view of history is not foreign to the education of people in this country. It is, in fact, it is it's the historic view of history in this country, the providential view. And I'm going to demonstrate with several examples here. Okay, so let's look at our first example. And this one, I'll try not to be too lengthy on the reading here, but I have a somewhat long reading. Maybe we'll skip through some of it. But this comes from The Ancient History of the Egyptians, Carthaginians, Assyrians, Babylonians, Medes, Persians, Macedonians, and Grecians, written by Charles Rollin in, I guess, 1700, early 1700s. But this edition, this publication date is 1768. All right. So this would have been, you could imagine yourself, um, actually, the one I have in front of me is from 1875. So as late as 1875, what we're going to read here was included in the history textbook. So imagine yourself, um, a young student heading off to school with eager to learn, right? And you would get to your one room schoolhouse, and the teacher would say, "Now take out your history books, take out your Rollins text, and here's what you would read as in the preface. The study of profane history would be unworthy of a serious attention and a considerable length of time if it were confined to the dry knowledge of ancient transactions and an unpleasing inquiry into the areas when each of them happened. It little concerns us to know that there was once such men as Alexander, Caesar, Aristides, or Cato, and that they lived in this or that period, that the empire of the Assyrians made way for that of the Babylonians, and the latter for the empire of the Medes and Persians, who were themselves subjected by the Macedonians, as these were afterwards by the Romans. This doesn't sound like this is the way you're going to start history class, right? I mean, in today's history classes, oh no, you need to know these things, right? If you don't know these things, you're doomed to repeat them or something, right? And here, this history author is saying this stuff is boring. Like, this isn't, but it highly concerns us to know by what methods those empires were founded, the steps by which they rose to the exalted pitch of grandeur we so much admire, what it was that constituted their true glory and felicity, and the causes of their declension and fall. And so notice over here in the margin, it says the causes of the rise and fall of empires. That's what concerns us about history. And in fact, and if I do too much side talking, we'll never get through what I want to read. But um, when we look at Webster's definition of the word history, Webster's 1828, of course, um, he defines history as an account of facts. He points out then that, I'm sorry, he defines it as an account of facts, and he says a narration of events in the order in which they happened with their causes and effects. And he says that's the difference between a history and an annal. An annal simply relates facts and events in chronological order, but a history regards less strictly the arrangement of events under each year and admits the observations of the writer. And those observations, of course, are delving into what are the causes and the effects of these things. Now, remember, you're the young student heading off to the new one-room schoolhouse in your little town in somewhere in the heart of the United States of America in 1875. And this is your new history book. I mean, it looks old here on our screen, but this would look brand new to you. And oh, this is, and the teacher would say, Johnny, would you read the next paragraph? Or it is of no less importance to study attentively the manners of different nations, their genius, laws, and customs, and especially to acquaint ourselves with the character and disposition, the talents, virtues, and even vices of those men by whom they were governed, and whose good or bad qualities contributed to the grandeur or decay of the states over which they presided. Everything about that paragraph was the reason why we would study about Alexander, Caesar, Aristides, Cato, these men who governed these empires, the Assyrian Empire, Babylonian, and such, was to see the causes and effects. How did these men contribute to the grandeur or contribute to the decay of these places. Such are the great objects which ancient history presents, exhibiting to our view all the kingdoms and empires of the world, and at the same time, all the great men who were anyways conspicuous thereby instructing us by example rather than precept in the arts of empire and war, the principles of government, the rules of policy, the maxims of civil society, and the conduct of life that suits all ages and conditions. Right? It's interesting that he says, so this is going to be learning by example, not by precept, because where would we learn by precept? Maybe he'll tell us here at some point. We acquire at the same time another knowledge which cannot but excite the attention of all persons who have a taste and inclination for polite learning. I mean, the manner in which arts and sciences were invented, cultivated, and improved. We there discover that and trace, as it were, with the eye, their origin and progress, and perceive with admiration that the nearer we approach those countries which were once inhabited by the sons of Noah, in the greater perfection we find the arts and sciences, and that they seem to be either neglected or forgot in proportion to the remoteness of nations from them. So that when men attempted to revive those arts and sciences, they were obliged to go back to the succor from whence they originally flowed. Okay, now you may not have followed that, right? But he said exactly what I said when I talked about history is not going from low intelligence to high intelligence consistently over time, but it's a flow that you see a high and then it goes low and now it returns high, right? And so what is he saying here? That the closer you get back to the time of Noah and his sons, the more perfect the arts and sciences are. And as you get away from them, they become less perfect. And those who are trying to restore perfection of those things go back to that, closer to that time of Noah. But another object of infinitely greater importance claims our intention. Wait a minute. It just keeps getting greater and greater importance here, what he's going through. For although profane history treats only of nations who had imbibed all the chimeras of a superstitious worship and abandoned themselves to all the irregularities of which human nature after the fall of the first man became capable, it nevertheless proclaims universally the greatness of the Almighty, his power, his justice, and above all, the admirable wisdom with which his providence governs the universe. Okay, so that's pretty cool, right? Little Johnny, little Susie, right? At church on Sunday, they hear the pastor boldly proclaiming the word and hearing about the majesty and the beauty and the power and the justice of the God of the universe. And that this God who is so majestic has his eye on them individually to care and provide for them. And then they go to school on Monday and they pull out their history book and they read this paragraph and they say, yeah, it's really true. It's really true. This reinforces what my pastor was telling me. If the inherent conviction of this last truth, if the inherent conviction of this last truth raised, according to Cicero's observation, the Romans above all other nations, we may in like manner affirm that nothing gives history a greater superiority to many other branches of literature than to see in a manner imprinted in almost every page of it the precious footsteps and shining proofs of this great truth that God disposes all events as supreme Lord and sovereign, that he alone determines the fate of kings and the duration of empires, and that he, for reasons inscrutable to all but himself, transfers the government of kingdoms from one nation to another. Uh, yeah, grab your if you have your history book from high school, your high school days, however recent or however long ago, and find the page that establishes this foundational truth about the study of history. When you read stories of current events, international matters, and political matters regarding things in the United States and what have you, is this your framework? At the end of all your thinking about present history, do you conclude with the acknowledgement, the recognition that for reasons that are beyond my ability to understand, God disposes all events as supreme Lord and sovereign? And see, as Christians, that's to comfort us, right? I think that we have a tendency to think that God's supposed to let us in on what he's doing, right? What's the latest in prophecy? Right? Like, what, God, what are you doing? Right? And, what are you doing? How, what chess are you playing, God? I want to know. And yet, biblically, and the wisdom of this particular author, no, your comfort is knowing that the events that transpire, God disposes those events as supreme Lord and sovereign. That is to be our comfort. And it's our comfort because we are to rest in the character of God. He is both loving and just. He is a God of great mercy and he is a God of wrath. Everything that would make a perfect lawmaker, king, and judge is contained within God and so much more. Let's continue on. We discover this important truth in going back to the most remote antiquity and the origin of profane history. I mean, to the dispersion of the posterity of Noah into the several countries of the earth where they settled. Okay, now the reason he says there, the beginning of profane history, right? And profane history simply means history outside the biblical narrative of history. Okay, and I mean, obviously, there's history outside that, right? Um, but the reason he points to the dispersion is that in his day, even among those historians who didn't care to take a view of history as our author here is taking, they at least had enough respect to realize that history prior to that point is unclear for them, right? So they're going to start where history is clear or clearer, and that would be at the dispersion. Liberty, chance, views of interest, a love for certain countries and such like motives were, in outward appearance, the only causes of the different choice which men made in these various migrations. Okay, so now he's pointing out um, in profane histories, this is what um, this is what they would put down as the motivations. And now let's see what he says next. But the scriptures inform us that amidst the trouble and confusion that followed the sudden change in the language of Noah's descendants, God presided invisibly over all their counsels and deliberations, that nothing was transacted but by the Almighty's appointment, and that he only guided and settled all mankind agreeably to the dictates of his mercy and justice. It was the Lord who scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of the earth. Now, these little symbols here, that's how they did footnotes then. They didn't use numbers, they used symbols. So I suppose there's a footnote down here. It says, the ancients themselves, according to Pindar, has retained some idea that the dispersion of men was not the effect of chance, but that they had been settled in different countries by the appointment of providence. Right? So he just points out that, even some who otherwise kind of discount the idea of providence admit in regard to this event that providence played a role. Okay, but you see, here's a providential view of history. How did we end up with the nations, the countries that we have? It wasn't by chance, it wasn't by happenstance. God moved the chess pieces around the board and said, you are going to be over here and make this nation, and you're going to be over there and make that nation. It is true indeed that God, sorry, I just want to see if I really want to read that section. Let me skip that paragraph. We'll go here. Not that there's anything wrong with that paragraph for sake of time. We must therefore consider as an indisputable principle and as the basis and foundation to the study of profane history that the providence of the Almighty has, from all eternity, appointed the establishment, duration, and destruction of kingdoms and empires, as well in regard to the general plan of the whole universe known only to God, who constitutes the order and wonderful harmony of its several parts, as particularly with respect to the people of Israel, and still more with regard to the Messiah and the establishment of the church, which is his great work, the end and design of all his other works, and ever present to his sight. Okay, and once again, I just want to remind you that, right, this would be little Johnny and little Susie in class in school in 1875. And this is how they would begin to understand the subject of history. The Latin there says something to the effect of known to the Lord are all his works from the beginning. Let's see, there's a little C there. Oh yeah, that's Acts 15:18. God has vouchsafed to discover to us in Holy Scripture a part of the relation of the several nations of the earth to his own people, and the little so discovered diffuses great light over the history of those nations, of whom we shall have but a very imperfect idea, unless we have recourse to the inspired writers. They alone display and bring to light the secret thoughts of princes, their incoherent projects, their foolish pride, their impious and cruel ambition. They reveal the true causes and hidden springs of victories and overthrows, of the grandeur and declension of nations, the rise and ruin of states, and teach us what judgment the Almighty forms both of princes and empires, and consequently what idea we ourselves ought to entertain of them. Okay, so what he's saying is, we can read these other histories that tell about these other nations, and we don't discount them. It's not that they're not telling us things that are true, but when it comes to ancient history, if we really want to understand causes and effects and what's going on with these other nations. It's divine scripture that informs us. Let's see, let's scroll a bit here. Not that there's anything wrong with what we're scrolling past, but for sake of time, you see. Maybe I've missed it here. Let's see. Because he gets into some particular histories there. You can see that as I scroll through that he's naming particular individuals, and they're really illustrations of what he just asserted. All right, so let's see. Right here. Besides the visible and sensible connection of sacred and profane history, there is another more sacred and more distinct relation with respect to the Messiah, for whose coming the Almighty, whose work was ever present to his sight, prepared mankind from far, even even by the state of ignorance and dissoluteness in which he suffered them to be immersed during 4,000 years. It was to show the necessity there was of our having a mediator, that God permitted the nations to walk after their own ways, and that neither the light of reason nor the dictates of philosophy could dispel their clouds of error or reform their depraved inclinations. Right, so here's one thing that I want you to see. This history, again, 1875, little Johnny, little Susie in the classroom, and this is what they're reading. This is what they're understanding as the basis of history. And the author is not embarrassed, ashamed, or doubtful of the single most significant event in history, and that is the coming of the Messiah and the reason for his coming. And in fact, connecting the reason for his coming to all that God was doing providentially in history leading up to this point. You know, probably most, and I don't know how to say this without sounding harsh and judgmental, but I've been accused of being judgmental most of my life, so I guess I'll just deal with it. I don't mean it to be, well, maybe I do mean it to be judgmental. You decide, all right? But by far, most professing Christian households send their children to the government schools. And I don't know if it ever occurs to those Christian households that those government schools lie about the single most important event in history. They lie about it. And as Christians, we profess how important the event of our Messiah is, and yet many Christian households, subject their children to training that lies about that. And for every, let's say one day that their children receive instruction regarding the Messiah, they then spend the next 5 days hearing nothing about its importance in history, its importance to them. And perhaps even being mocked and ridiculed and disciplined should they bring up the question. But not this author, not 1875 in this nation. This author is pleased to put as a central part of his foundation stone for the study of history, for history done right, the Messiah. Continuing on, when we take a view of the grandeur of empires, the majesty of princes, the glorious actions of great men, the order of civil societies, and the harmony of the different members of which they are composed, the wisdom of legislators and the learning of philosophers, the earth seems to exhibit nothing to the eye of man but what is great and resplendent. Nevertheless, in the eye of God, it was equally barren and uncultivated as at the first instant of the creation by the Almighty fiat. Right? His first work of creation out of nothing. Right? Right? The earth was formless and void, right? The scriptures tell us. And here the author's making the point. We're going to be amazed as we read this particular history. We're going to be amazed at how grand these empires are and the majesty of the princes and the glorious actions of great men and how orderly the societies seem to be and harmony seems to exist between members at times and wise legislators through the. And he's pointing out to God all the best of what men do out of their own sinful natures is just barrenness. It's just barrenness. This is saying but little. It was wholly polluted and impure. The reader will observe that I speak of the heathens, and appeared to God only as the haunt and retreat of ungrateful and perfidious men. As it did at the time of the flood, the earth was corrupt before God and was filled with iniquity. Okay, that's a great turn of phrase there. The earth was the haunt and retreat of ungrateful and perfidious men. Maybe that's what it is again today. Nevertheless, the sovereign arbiter of the universe who, pursuant to the dictates of his wisdom, dispenses both light and darkness and knows how to check the impetuous torrent of human passions, would not permit mankind, though abandoned to the utmost corruptions, to degenerate into absolute barbarity and brutalize themselves in a manner by the extinction of the first principles of the law of nature, as is seen in several savage nations. Okay, that's a long sentence, a pretty powerful sentence, and it speaks, right? So here we are in our history book, and we're getting an accurate picture of man in his sinful, lost condition, and a just and merciful God who cares, who involves himself in that circumstance. Such an obstacle would have retarded too much the rapid course promised by him to the first preachers of the doctrine of his Son. He darted from far into the minds of men the rays of several great truths to dispose them for the reception of others of a more important nature. Okay, and again, I just want to remind you that this is 1875 public school, right? This is your country, right? This was how your country wanted its children to learn history, not the idiocy that we have today in what passes as history classes. Okay? Follow here. He, that is God, prepared them for the instructions of the gospel by those of philosophers. And it was with this view that God permitted the heathen professors to examine in their schools several questions and establish several principles which are nearly allied to religion, and to engage the attention of mankind by the spirit and beauty of their disputations. Okay, so this is a wonderful way to demonstrate God's providence in history, is to point out that those who otherwise have really no demonstrated care or concern for God, as the one true God to be worshipped and served, and At best, he's just some ambiguous or vague thought, kind of the idea of, God, whatever you perceive it to be, kind of thing. And yet they can't help themselves. They explore what we would call as Christians biblical truths and ideas. In fact, in a literature class I'm teaching, we read White Fang and The Call of the Wild, two books by an author named Jack London. And what's fascinating is that Jack London was a self-professed atheist, I guess. Um, didn't care for religion, Christianity in particular. Um, identified himself as a materialist, so no thought of the supernatural. Um, um, Essentially said, you live, you die, and then you're food for worms kind of view. But when you read those two books, The Call of the Wild and White Fang, The Call of the Wild is essentially, um, with animals, the story Paradise Lost by John Milton, if you're familiar with that. It's a story that the main character, a dog, begins essentially in paradise and falls from paradise and ends up doomed in a wild, savage place. White Fang is the story of one who is born into a wild and savage place and is literally redeemed and saved from death and then brought into paradise restored. And it's and in fact, Jack London essentially admits that that's the themes he was presenting. It's like, here's a guy who doesn't even care about biblical truth to that degree, and yet he's fascinated with the biblical narrative of mankind's fall from innocence into the pits of sinfulness and the Redeemer's redemption of mankind from that to a restored paradise. And I think that's essentially what our author is saying here, that these philosophers and such start delving into questions that they just can't ignore, even though everything about their worldview says it really doesn't matter. It is well known that the philosophers inculcate in every part of their writings the existence of a God, the necessity of a providence that presides in the government of the world, the immortality of the soul, the ultimate end of man, the reward of the good and punishment of the wicked, the nature of those duties which constitute the band of society, the character of the virtues that are the basis of morality, as prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, and such like truths, which, though incapable of guiding men to righteousness, yet they were of use to scatter certain clouds and to dispel certain obscurities, right? This was their effort to take care of the guilt that all men feel, right? Everybody knows they're guilty, and they're just trying to figure out how do I satisfy and take away that guilt. And without Christianity, what are you left with? You're left with building grand philosophies that rationalize things and soothe your guilt, or doing great works of benevolence constantly, or doing extreme sports, right? Or a lot of drinking or turning to drugs or what. Everybody's trying to figure out how to push the guilt out of their mind and their heart. And they need to know that there's one cure of that guilt. It is by an effect of the same providence which prepared from far the ways of the gospel, that when the Messiah revealed himself in the flesh, God had united together a great number of nations by the Greek and Latin tongues, and had subjected to one monarch from the ocean to the Euphrates all the people not united by language, in order to give a more free course to the preaching of the apostles. When profane history is studied with judgment and maturity, it must lead us to these reflections and point out to us the manner in which the Almighty makes the empires of the earth subservient to the reign of his son. See, history done right knows that Christ reigns on high. And then the kings of the earth are subservient to the King of Kings, right? And here we have 1875 United States schools. We have a history book that is doing history right. And it's setting at the very first for the student, little Johnny and little Susie. This is how you're going to understand history best. This is how you're going to understand history right. It ought likewise to teach us the value of all that glitters most in the eye of the world and is most capable of dazzling it. Valor, fortitude, skill in government, profound policy, merit in magistracy, capacity for the most abstruse sciences, beauty of genius, universal taste, and perfection in all arts. These are the objects which profane history exhibits to us, which excites our admiration and often our envy. But at the same time, this very history ought to remind us that the Almighty, ever since the creation, has indulged to his enemies all those shining qualities which the world esteems, and on which it frequently bestows the highest eulogisms or eulogiums, and on the contrary, that he often refuses them to his most faithful servants, whom he endues with talents of an infinitely superior nature, though men neither know their value nor are desirous of them. Happy is that people that is in such a case. Yea, happy is that people whose God is the Lord. I mean, um, that's powerful, right? Because here you have in history class, because you have an author that wants to present a providential view of history, you have in history class a very important moral being taught to the students. Look, when you read these histories and you read about the great accomplishments of these people, you're going to be dazzled by this. And you're going to think that's amazing what this person accomplished, what that person did, and how much wealth that one accumulated, and how much fame this one got. And you're going to be dazzled by all of that. But please always remember and never forget that what really matters, what's really of value. All right, we'll skip ahead a bit here. Not because there's anything wrong with what he says there, just sake of time. Students ought to take care, and especially we who, by the duties of our profession, are obliged to be perpetually conversant with heathen authors, not to enter too far into the spirit of them. Okay, so here's an author who's humbly acknowledging that I have to be careful about this. I have to be careful about how immersed I am in these heathen authors of history. Not to imbibe unperceived their sentiments by lavishing too great applauses on their heroes, nor to give in to excesses which the heathens indeed did not consider as such, because they were not acquainted with virtues of a purer kind. Some persons, whose friendship I esteem as I ought, and for whose learning and judgment I have the highest regard, have found this defect in some parts of my work on the method of teaching and studying the Belles Letters. The Belles Letters, just think the great works of the past, and are of opinion that I have gone to great lengths in the encomiums I bestow on the illustrious men of antiquity. Okay, so here he's making a confession, and um, I've gotten into parts that I hadn't intended to read. But he's making confession that there are those who criticize him for going too uh, too far into that. Let's see. Okay, so he's dealing with that, and I think he tries to maybe defend himself somewhat in his approach, but he's already acknowledged that this is something we have to be careful about, um, not to get too um, immersed in uh, in these heathen authors, right? We want to acknowledge, I mean, we want to acknowledge that which is beautiful and that which is true and that which is right. And we commend um, any person for their good works because we would much rather live in a world filled with good works than not. But we never want to lose sight of what's truly important, those virtues of a purer kind, as he said. All right, so scrolling. All right. So somewhere that I missed here, he writes, true piety, that is without a sincere worship of God, there can be no true virtue, and that no virtue can be such whose object is worldly glory, right? So he's just saying what Washington said, right? There's no virtue without morality. There's no morality without religion, and that religion which presents morality is the Christian religion. Okay. And then he picks up here, this was a false religion and a mistaken worship, and yet the people of it was laudable and founded in nature. The stream was corrupted, but the fountain was pure. Man, when abandoned to his own ideas, sees nothing beyond the present moment. That's a good sentence right there that we could spend some time thinking about. Futurity is to him an abyss invisible to the most eagle-eyed, the most piercing sagacity, and exhibits nothing on which he may fix his views or form any resolution with certainty. He is equally feeble and impotent with regard to the execution of his designs. He is sensible that he is dependent entirely on a supreme power that disposes all events with absolute authority, and which, in spite of his utmost efforts and of the wisdom of the best concerted schemes, by only raising the smallest obstacles and slightest modifications, renders it impossible for him to execute his measures. This obscurity and weakness oblige him to have recourse to a superior knowledge and power. He is forced, both by his immediate wants and the strong desire he has to succeed in all his undertakings, to address that being whom he is sensible has reserved to himself alone the knowledge of futurity and the power of disposing it as he sees fitting. Okay. So it seems like what our author is saying here is that in spite of himself, mankind will find himself um, pleading to this supreme being that he knows is there. Scripture tells us that everybody knows God is there, and they suppress that truth in unrighteousness. Romans 1, right? And so, in spite of himself, he ends up pleading, "God help me," and he's. I think he's suggesting that this is a strategy of God's to bring otherwise arrogant, independent, self-reliant, sinful creatures to their knees and plead for the beneficent help of the Supreme Being, the one who disposes all events as he sees fit. And in fact, as a person comes to that point where he makes that plea, right, he's acknowledging that it is in God's hands to dispose of things as he sees fit, right? The parent who otherwise gives no thought to Christianity, church, the Bible, the moment A child is diagnosed with a serious illness, and suddenly they find themselves, when they're alone, pleading to a God that they've never given the time of day to before, to please take it away. They're relying upon the character, the quality, the attribute of God that he is the one who can dispose of events as he sees fit. And they plead to him for such a thing. And in that moment, they are um, acknowledging, in spite of themselves, they're acknowledging their entire dependence upon this God. He accordingly directs prayers, makes vows, and offers sacrifices to prevail, if possible, with the deity to reveal himself, either in dreams and oracles or other signs which may manifest his will, fully convinced that nothing can happen but by the divine appointment, and that it is a man's greatest interest to know his supreme will in order to conform his actions to it. This religious principle of dependence on and veneration of the supreme being is natural to man. It is forever imprinted deep in his heart. He is reminded of it by the inward sense of his extreme indigence and by all the objects which surround him. And it may be affirmed that this perpetual recourse to the deity is one of the principal foundations of religion and the strongest band by which man is united to his creator. Um, Yeah, this is just the proper understanding, foundational understanding that man is a religious creature. Man will have a God. Those who were so happy as to know the true God and were chosen to be his peculiar people never failed to address him in all their wants and doubts in order to obtain his succor and the manifestation of his will. He accordingly was so gracious as to reveal himself to them, to conduct them by apparitions, dreams, oracles, and prophecies, and to protect them by miracles of the most astonishing kind. But those who were so blind as to substitute falsehood in the place of truth directed themselves for the like aid to fictitious and deceitful deities who were not able to answer their expectations nor recompense the homage that mortals paid them any otherwise than by error and illusion and a fraudulent imitation of the conduct of the true God. Okay, so those two paragraphs, like, um, that's that's the summary of how things have gone in history for people, right? You're either in this, you're either part of this blessed group that knows the true God and is particularly cared for by that God, or you're in this other group of just falsehood, this fantasy land, this um, living foolishly and having nothing but error and illusion and a fraudulent imitation. Hence arose the vain observation of dreams, which from a superstitious credulity they mistook for salutary warnings from heaven, those obscure and equivocal answers of oracles, beneath whose veil the spirits of darkness concealed their ignorance, and by a studied ambiguity reserved to themselves an evasion or subterfuge, whatever might be the issue of the event. To this are owing the prognostics with regard to futurity, which men fancied they should find in the entrails of beasts, in the flight and singing of birds, in the aspect of the planets, in fortuitous accidents, and in the caprice of chance. Those dreadful prodigies that filled a whole nation with terror, and which, as was believed, nothing could expiate but mournful ceremonies and even sometimes the effusion of human blood. In fine, or in the end, those black inventions of magic, those delusions, enchantments, sorceries, invocations of ghosts and many other kinds of divination. Right, there's a description of the fraudulent imitation of the conduct of the true God, right? That's what became of those that were so blind as to substitute falsehood in the place of truth. All right. Oh, I haven't even hit the 2 hour mark yet. So we're scrolling. Not that there's, anything wrong with what he says here, but for sake of time, we scroll ahead to, let's see. Um, blah, blah, blah. This is a long preface, isn't it? Scrolling. Here he's talking about the specific sections of his text and what nations or countries or empires, what have you, will be studied. Somewhere we get to a conclusion of the feasts, the Panthena. I'm sure this is exciting for you to watch me scroll through. Oh, I'm not making you seasick by scrolling so quickly, but we'll get to where we're trying to go here. I should have marked all of this. You're right. You're right. I should have had this all marked out so I could just quickly go to where I needed to go. Um, um, let's see. Of oracles. And it's kind of dealing with the all that falsehood that he spoke about specifically, and all the different ways that ancient nations tried to uncover or discover true truth, and but they're blindly groping for that which they don't know. Um, Here said the triumph of the Christian religion. That sounded important, but that's not where I want to go, is it? Um, of the games and combats. Well, good grief, is he just doing his whole history in here as preface? All right, we got it. Of the athlete or combatants. I mean, it's all good stuff. Don't get me wrong; it's all good stuff there. But for sake of time, I'm scrolling through, and we'll get to where. Hang in there with me. Don't. If you're watching this video later, of course, if you're watching it later, you may not hear this, but if you're watching this later, you could just fast forward the video to where you see me actually pausing and reading. Okay, no, that's not it. Um, Come on now. Well, I guess I could search. I could actually search. Let's find a good word here. We could do this. Let's see if we click the search here. Let's try this. Let's search this word. This word probably doesn't show up too much. And we'll see where it takes us. Excites our admiration. We'll see, what page number am I on? I'm at 116, so we need to get, let's see. Worthy of admiration. Gratitude and admiration? No, I need esteem and admiration. I don't see esteem and admiration. What? That says 132. Let's see. Excites our admiration, but that's 41. Arg. The search didn't work. Rats. Whoops. Now we're way out of kilter there. Hang in there. We'll get there. Here, let's. Oh, but see, these are. I don't know how it does that. Let's try one more search. No results found. Okay, that no. Try another one. Warriors. Oh, that's so close. Okay, I don't get it. Why is this not, these searches not working? Um, all right, we may just have to wrap up here, and I may have to find this and we can pick it up next time. I really wanted to conclude at least this part. I had other readings to go through today. Um, but this isn't this isn't going well because see, we're at the of the ancient and middle new. Okay. Um, Maybe when I finish this video, I'll edit this portion out so it just jumps to where we need to be, and then it will look like I was well prepared and a good. Because see, here we're at the epics of the Jewish history. We need to get beyond that because need to get to some kind of a conclusion here. What did that say right there? That heading, Lycurgus. Okay. Um, oh my. So he's still talking about history that he's going to have us learn about. Oh wait, there I've entered into part the first. So did I miss it? Arg. Well, let me just read from what I have in front of me. You won't be able to follow along. Um, because it says here conclusion of the whole work. So I mean, maybe this comes from somewhere later in his work. I don't know how many volumes he has here, but maybe it's at the very end of his work here. No. Okay, let me just read here. On the one side, we see princes, warriors, and conquerors. On the other, magistrates, politicians, and legislators. And in the midst of both, the learned of all kinds, who by the utility, beauty, or sublimity of their knowledge have acquired immortal reputation. These three classes include, in my opinion, all that is most shining and most attractive of esteem and admiration in human greatness. I consider the universe here only in its fairest light, and for a moment take off my view from all the vices and disorders that disturb its beauty and economy. Before me stand princes and kings, full of wisdom and prudence in their councils, of equity and justice in the government of their people, of valor and intrepidity in battle, of moderation and clemency in victory, subjecting many kingdoms, founding vast empires, and acquiring the love of the conquered nations no less than of their own subjects. Such was Cyrus. At the same time, I see a multitude of Greeks and Romans equally illustrious in war and peace, generals of the most exalted bravery and military knowledge, politicians of exceeding ability in the arts of government, famous legislators whose laws and institutions still amaze us, while they seem almost incredible. So much they appear above humanity. magistrates venerable for their love of the public good, judges of great wisdom, incorruptible and proof against all that contempt avidity. And lastly, citizens entirely devoted to their country, whose generous and noble disinterestedness rises so high as the contempt of riches and the esteem and love of poverty. If I turn my eyes towards the arts and sciences, what luster do not the multitude of admirable works come down to us display, in which shine forth according to the difference of subjects, art and disposition, greatness of genius, riches of invention, beauty of style, solidity of judgment, and profound erudition. Right? And so in all of this, he has said, let's just set aside the wickedness of mankind, right? The vices and disorders that disturb his beauty and economy. And look at all the admirable things that we can find in these different actors in history. And he wants us to take note of that. And so then he says something similar about the philosophers of history. But then he says this, the just judge of all things, and that's a capital J judge there, by whose judgment it is our duty to direct our own, absolutely denies it them. He's referring to this question that ended the paragraph before that said, do not men of such profound knowledge and understanding deserve the name of sages? I have said elsewhere, the Lord, says the royal prophet, looked down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there were any that did understand and seek God. The earth is full of persons that excel in arts and sciences. There are many philosophers, orators, and politicians. There are even many legislators, interpreters of laws, and ministers of justice. Many are consulted as persons of extraordinary wisdom, and their answers are considered as decisions from which it is not allowable to depart. However, among so many wise and intelligent persons in the sight of men, God discerns none that are not foolish and mad. Right? So this is just such an interesting section here because the author points out all these great accomplishments of men and admirable characteristics in fallen men and the wisdom of philosophers. And yet he has to acknowledge that God discerns none that are not foolish and mad. They are all gone aside. They are altogether filthy. There is none that doth good. No, not one, says God. This censure is general and without exception. What then is wanting in these pretended wise men? And I just want to remind you once again, and I know I've gone, I'm approaching the 2 hour mark, but this is huge, right? If you want to do history right, history done right will always remember and never forget what I'm about to read, what this author puts here, okay? And don't forget, this is 1875, little Johnny, little Susie goes to the one-room schoolhouse and they pull out their history book and the kindly teacher says, let's read our preface to our history book. And they're reading this together and they read about the great feats of individuals and the wisdom and the science and the art, and it's all admirable and beautiful and wonderful. But don't forget, children, God takes a different view of those things. And so little Johnny and little Susie is told, stand up and read that sentence right there. And she reads, God says they are all gone aside, they are altogether filthy, there is none that doth good, no, not one. The censure is general and without exception. There's no exception to this censure. And then the big question, what then is wanting in these pretended wise men? And maybe the teacher even asks students for what they think. What do you think? What's missing? Here's what this author says. The fear of God, without which there is no true wisdom, to see if there was any that did understand and seek God, the knowledge of their own misery and corruption, and their want of a mediator and a restorer or redeemer. Everything is in esteem among them, except religion and piety. They know neither the use nor end of anything. They go on without design or knowing whither they should end. They are ignorant of what they are and what shall become of them. Can folly be more clear and evident? Isn't that stunning? Like, um, doesn't this put everything into proper perspective? The thoughts of God are very different from those of men. The universe, peopled with powerful kings, famous legislators, celebrated philosophers, and learned men of all kinds, is the object of our admiration and praise. And God sees nothing but disorder and corruption in it. The earth was corrupt before God. The qualities, knowledge, and maxims of which I speak were, however, very estimable in themselves. They were the gifts of God, from whom alone come all good and all knowledge. But the pagans perverted their nature by the unworthy use they made of them, in considering themselves as their principle and end. I speak here even of those among them who passed for the best and wisest, whose virtue were infected either with pride or ingratitude, or to speak more properly, with both. I have observed that certain ages, which abounded with illustrious examples either at Athens or Rome, exhibit a grand and noble scene in history. But there was at the same time a circumstance which highly disgraced the glory and sullied the beauty of these ages. I mean the idolatry that generally prevailed throughout the universe. The whole earth was covered with thick darkness and lay plunged in gross and stupid ignorance. Only one country, and that of very small extent, knew the true God. In Judah is God known. His name is great in Israel. Elsewhere, all mouths were mute in respect to him, and the hymns of idolatrous solemnities were only invitations to crimes which the seducer of mankind had made their duty. God suffered all nations to walk each after their own way, to make themselves gods of all creatures, to adore all their own passions, to abandon themselves through despair to those which are most shameful, to be ignorant of their origin and end, to direct their lives by errors and fable, and believe everything indiscriminately or nothing at all. One would imagine that man, situated in the midst of the wonders which fill all nature and largely possessed of the good things of God, could not forget him or remember him without adoration and fidelity. But in the midst of the greatest light, he behaved like the blind. He became deaf to all the voices that proclaimed the majesty and holiness of the Creator. He adopted everything except God. The stars and sun that declared the divinity, he honored in his stead. Wood and stone, under 1,000 forms, which his wild imagination had invented, were become his gods. In a word, false religion had deluged the whole earth. And if some few were less stupid than the rest, they were equally impious and ungrateful. Did not the only one of these, who had explained himself too clearly, deny in public what he believed in private? He's referring to Socrates there. Whence we may observe of what avail the reason of all mankind was, when they had no other guide. We see here the principal fruits to be derived from the study of profane history, of which every page declares what mankind were during so many ages and what we ourselves should still have been had not the peculiar mercy which made known the Savior of the world to us drawn us out of the abyss in which all our forefathers were swallowed up. It is of the Lord's mercies we are not consumed, a mercy freely and entirely conferred, which we have no power to deserve in any manner of ourselves, and for which we ought to render eternal homage of gratitude and praise to the grace of Jesus Christ. You want to do history right? You want to experience history done right? The author we just read in his preface to his history tells you this is what history done right looks like. And I offer this to you kind of in a twofold purpose. One, so that we ourselves can always approach our thinking of history, whether it's ancient history or present history, from the proper perspective, the providential view. And also that you can know that it is the history of this nation, the United States, in which, well, I guess people could be watching from anywhere, but the country in which I live, it's the history of this country to approach history from that providential view. And to not be ashamed to proclaim the gospel in the midst of the history textbook used in school. I have more examples of that. We'll have to save it for next week because I mean this is hugely critical. It's not unimportant that we understand how to approach history, that we understand these two foundation stones, as I called them, that I've talked about tonight. The first, the God of the Bible is the creator of all things that exist, just as recorded in the Bible, right? And again, if you're not settled on the truth that the Bible is the book, all capitals, by way of eminence, then you need to read it more, be in prayer, ask that the Holy Spirit help you embrace that truth, and find other resources that will bolster your faith that the Bible is God's true word and you can believe it. And it tells you the truth of things that it speaks to. And then our second foundation stone, this providential view of history, which was, I think, in what I spent too much time reading, probably, is amazingly presented by our author, Charles Rollin, right? Charles Rollin is his name. In his work, The Ancient History of the Egyptians, Carthaginians, Assyrians, Babylonians, Medes and Persians, and Macedonians. Well, I hope that was instructive for you and encouraging. Perhaps gives you a new and better way to think about history. And if you find yourself to be one who's interested in what it looks like when history is done right, then come on back next week when we continue History Done Right. And we try to explore history at every point from with this providential view. As the author we read today expressed. Hey, thanks for being a part. Do the thing, the YouTube thing, right? Like, subscribe. That'd be cool. Let somebody else know about the video. Tell them about the one part there where I'm just kind of fumbling around, and just tell them just skip that part. Eventually, you'll just start reading, and so they don't have to sit through my foolishness there. But yeah, it'd be great to have a good number of people view this, and particularly for believers to have us start moving away from the wrong view of history that's been pounded into us by modern culture, and really embrace a view of history that was commonplace in our school textbooks previously. Hey, you have a good week. Don't forget to join us tomorrow night. It'll be Tuesday night, for the Lantern's Quest podcast. We're going to continue our Exploring the Sketchbook of Christ. Wednesday, our midweek study. We're going to be finishing up the Christianity and National Law sermon on Wednesday. Then Friday, our next Random Cast podcast. Let people know about the different podcasts we have, and I'd love to have more people view the videos. I'd love to have comments posted that we can respond to. That would be great. Um, so yeah, um, next week we will do more with our history done right, and love to have you be a part of that as we continue our exploration of that subject. So you have a blessed night, a good week, and I hope to see you in future podcasts. Thanks for being a part tonight. Yeah, God bless. Have a good